Story 1. I went out dancing with my girlfriend at the time in an area with many clubs that is generally safe, as long as you stick to the main streets and well-lit areas. We were walking back to the car and had just left the main street to head to the parking lot, when I suddenly felt a wave of panic and stopped in my tracks to look around. My girlfriend asked, "What? What's wrong?" I replied, "I don't know, but I feel like we need to go back for a few minutes until more people are around." So we went back and waited for more people walking in our direction. Actually, a police car that patrolled the area arrived, and I walked over to ask the officer, "Can you watch us walk to my car? It's just right over there. I feel like someone is waiting for us to be alone." We walked to the car, and a man in a hoodie and with a gun jumped out and demanded our valuables. The officer immediately turned on his lights and siren, and his tires screeched as he sped over. The man bolted at that moment. The police chased after him, and I have no idea if they caught him, but if I hadn't experienced that unexplainable fear and instinct, we would have likely been robbed, or maybe even shot. I still can't explain how I knew because I didn't see anyone. I just felt in danger. Story 2. I have told this story before, so I will just summarize it. At the time, my boyfriend and I were house sitting for his uncle. My boyfriend was at work, and I was bathing our son before bed. I had the bathroom window, which faced the backyard, slightly cracked and heard a cough from outside. This house was in a residential neighborhood, so it could have been a neighbor, but I suddenly felt anxious and scared, and something told me to check the back door to make sure it was locked. I left my 2-year-old son alone in a towel in the bathroom and ran to the back door. As I placed my hand on the doorknob to lock it, I came face to face with someone outside who had his hand on the doorknob. He started pounding on the door and jiggling the knob, saying he was looking for someone. I told him no, they were not here. He continued to jiggle the doorknob, and I ran back to my son to grab my cell phone and call for help. At that time, in 2004 or 2005, we had flip phones, not smartphones where you could easily look up a map. I had no idea what the address was or where the house phone was. I called emergency services from the bathroom while hearing loud pounding on the back door. The dispatcher told me to find a house phone or any piece of mail with the address. I located the house phone and called emergency services again. I have no idea how the police arrived so quickly, but just as I heard the back door glass break, the dispatcher instructed me to cover my son's head with a blanket and run out the front door to the back seat of a police car. I ran out the front door and saw 6 or more police cars with their guns drawn, and I went straight into a waiting cruiser. After they arrested the man, they asked me if the machete on the back porch belonged to the owners of the house. He had a machete, and had I not trusted my instincts about the cough sounding too close and checked the back door, he would have walked right into an unlocked house with a 19-year-old female and her young son alone. It turned out he had been robbing houses and had a backpack full of stolen items while he was under the influence of methamphetamine. I am really glad I followed my instincts on that one. Story 3. I knew that I had cancer. I am also pregnant, and the outward symptoms were so similar that it would have been easy to overlook me. Fortunately, everyone took me seriously enough to expedite tests, even while reassuring me that I was wrong. When the consultant called to inform me that I had a mass in my chest, he sounded shocked. "I started chemotherapy this week. My baby and I are going to get through this." Story 4. Not me, but my great-aunt's gut instinct is the reason I'm still here to tell this story. We were visiting family in Brazil over Christmas break when I was a child. One of the things they do in Rio for New Year's is take party boats out in the bay and watch the fireworks show that they shoot off from the beach. My great-aunt and uncle bought us all tickets for one of the boats. When we arrived, she took one look at the boat and refused to board it. She ended up losing the cost of the tickets and buying us last-minute tickets for another boat. Cost her a small fortune, and we all thought she was crazy. The boat we were supposed to be on eventually became overloaded with passengers, but it wasn't that way when we got there. The water was choppy that night, and it capsized at about 11:45. Dozens of people on it drowned, including a famous Brazilian actress and most of the children on the boat. The phone in my great-aunt's apartment started ringing at 6 a.m. from people who heard the news and were making sure we weren't on that boat. We had no idea what had happened until that first phone call. After she got off the phone, which had woken us all up, She looked like she had seen a ghost. Story 5. Years ago, as a resident at the end of a 12-hour shift, I walked into an examination room in the emergency room to see another patient that night with cold symptoms. Although her examination revealed only those symptoms, I instinctively knew that this 4-year-old was dealing with something much more serious. I ordered laboratory tests which identified leukemia in an early stage. Story 6. I felt like the car behind me was going to hit me, so I moved over to the next lane, and it hit the car that was originally in front of me. Story 7. 1,000 people have a similar story, I'm sure, but here goes. On September 10th, 2001, I was headed from the United States, leaving from Newark to France to start a postgraduate degree. A family friend reached out to ask if I could move my flight back a few days to stay with him in the city and meet some coworkers in the office the next day. He worked in the South Tower. My parents were very supportive of my plans, as they thought it was a great opportunity for me to network, and they loved that I was spending time with their best friend's child, who had a classic small-town made-good story. By any indication, it was a great opportunity and should have been a fun experience. I recall leaving my hotel for the airport with a real sense of foreboding, one that went beyond worrying about changing my flight or showing up late to pick up the keys to my apartment in Paris. It was a gut feeling I had only experienced a few times in my life, like when I knew I was in physical danger, such as when someone broke into my house at night while I was in bed. In this instance, however, I had no rational explanation for that feeling. I forwarded my apologies to our family friend, making some excuses about needing to meet with professors before classes started, and I caught my flight. It was the best decision I ever made, unknowingly, but I had a strange premonition about it. I still have no idea why I felt that ominous sense. On a happy note, my friend got out okay and is doing fine. Story 8. I knew a man who seemed a bit too nice, cool, and open. He lived down the street from a friend of mine, and when I was around 19 or 20, he took us hunting a few times. He was in his early 30s and seemed to enjoy teaching young men how to hunt. His wife never minded him often spending time with young men who needed a positive male role model instead of their own fathers. However, I felt I shouldn't speak openly with him or answer all his questions. We had fun, but I had a gut feeling that he shouldn't know too much about me. Recently, I discovered that he served 4 years for production and possession of child pornography and sexual abuse of children. I knew some of the girls and boys he exploited. Multiple parents trusted him for years. I once had a crush on one of the girls he filmed. He recruited the children gradually. He would get to know one and then their friends and so on. I was part of his informal recruitment network, driven around in his recruitment truck, and visited his hunting camp where inappropriate activities occurred. But my intuition isn't always right. One of the most positive and influential role models of my 20s turned out to be involved in offering sexual lessons to teenage girls. I had no idea. Story 9. My brother has epilepsy caused by cranial angioma tumors. One day, I was at home with my 3 young children when out of nowhere, my stomach dropped and my whole body tingled. My heart skipped a few beats, and I started breathing rapidly. I had a horrid feeling that I needed to find my brother immediately. There was something wrong, and I had to locate him. I hurried to my father's house in my car to find my 17-year-old brother lying on the kitchen floor, with my other siblings attempting cardiopulmonary resuscitation. He had a grand mal seizure and his heart stopped. I was the only one who knew CPR and managed to revive him after about 30 seconds. I rushed him to the hospital, where they performed an emergency craniotomy to remove a bleeding angioma. He made a full recovery. That was 15 years ago, and he is perfectly healthy now, although he is on anticonvulsants. No one informed me he was at my dad's house. He didn't spend much time there, but I absolutely knew that's where he was. There was no doubt in my mind. I just knew he was there and needed me. I do not ignore my instincts. I don't think anyone would have believed me if I hadn't had witnesses. I literally showed up and saved the day, and his life. I have always felt closer to him than my other siblings. Intuition exists for a reason. Story 10. My husband became incredibly unwell during the night and was in excruciating pain. I called for an ambulance, and the operator advised me that it wasn't an emergency and suggested I wait until the next morning to bring him to see his regular doctor. I instinctively knew something was wrong and took him to the hospital myself, experiencing what was the most harrowing drive of my life. It turned out he had a life-threatening condition and a resultant infection. He went septic within an hour of arrival at the hospital. Waiting a minimum of 8 hours to see the doctor in the morning could have been fatal. I will never doubt my instincts again. Story 11. Far more mundane than these other examples, I almost always have a strong sense of time. I set a timer on my oven to cook, and without checking the start time, I get up to check it about 30 seconds before the alarm sounds. I'm not trying to, but something tells me I should probably go check it. Story 12. Not me, but my mom. She was set to marry my stepdad in a few weeks, with invitations already sent out, but she had a feeling she needed to cancel. She told my stepdad she just felt they should not get married on that day, so they called it off temporarily. It turns out her best friend died tragically in a car crash the night before the wedding was supposed to take place, and she spent that day experiencing that loss. Story 13. When I was 10 years old, my dad was burning leaves along our elevated driveway. I felt sick to my stomach all day but knew I wasn't ill. We left for a birthday party at the YMCA shortly after, and I kept having panic attacks, telling my little sister something was wrong at home. My dad grew angry every time I mentioned it. I couldn't play, eat cake, or do anything. At the end of the party, we received a call that our house was engulfed in flames. We lived in the Ozarks, and you could see the house at the top of one of the hills burning as we drove down the highway toward the neighborhood entrance. My dad laughed, saying, "My house is on fire again." We had 3 previous incidents. One from a lightning strike, one from a field fire that spread to our porch from a neighbor's pasture, and the other my fault from knocking over a candle. Fortunately, all were extinguished quickly. The house was a total loss. Luckily, my parents were divorced, and most of our belongings were at my mom's, but all of our childhood photos and memories were in that house. Turned out it was arson, and my dad wanted a pool. He was not a good person. I picked up on his body language and behaviors and knew something was wrong but couldn't figure it out. Story 14. When I first started dating my now husband, I went to a wedding with him for someone he worked with. There was a guy there whom he introduced me to, and I immediately knew he was trouble. I told my husband that something was wrong with that guy. He said, "No, he is a good guy." Turned out he had been abusing his girlfriend. There were more issues that surfaced, but I forget the details as it was a while ago. Ultimately, he ended up getting fired. He was truly unpleasant. Story 15. I was taking an Uber home after a long trip. I've probably seen 3 deer in 2 years of living on my street. Somehow, I instinctively told the Uber driver, "Hey, there are a lot of deer here. Be careful." 10 seconds later, a deer ran directly in front of his car, and he was able to stop short. Story 16. I strongly disliked a coworker's partner. Everyone else said he was a great, engaging person, but he didn't come across that way to me. It was as if we were seeing 2 different people. Surprisingly, he turned out to be abusive. I was right. Story 17. My 2 friends and I were typical teenage boys, so when we found an abandoned giant wooden spool at a construction site, our first reaction was to take it to the skate park and roll it down the quarter pipes. After a while, my friend had the bright idea to climb inside the spool while my other friend pushed him down a ramp as I filmed it. I had a bad feeling about it and warned him that he might get hurt, but he was adamant that he would be fine. When he started rolling down the ramp, his weight caused the spool to veer off course towards a grind rail that protruded from the supports. I dropped my phone and sprinted towards the spool to jump in front and try to stop him. The spool knocked me down and I hurt my wrist, but I managed to slow it down significantly before it hit the rail. That metal rail tore through the wood and hit my friend in the stomach with enough force to leave a bruise. If I hadn't jumped in front of the spool to slow it down and it had hit that rail at full speed, my friend would have been seriously injured. So, Nick, if you're reading this, you owe me your life, and I hope my sons aren't as reckless as we were when they are teenagers. Story 18. We were at a friendly gathering with my ex. It was a large table and everything seemed enjoyable. People were cheerful, joking, and smiling. Then, I suddenly had an odd feeling and asked to leave. I had to insist several times, and my girlfriend gave me a hard time on the way out, acting as if I were being paranoid. 2 hours after we left, a guy at our table beat another so badly that he was hospitalized with life-altering injuries. Story 19. Not me, but my friend. He was surveying a pipeline right-of-way in the bush and couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. After about half an hour of stopping to look around out of paranoia every few minutes, he noticed something behind a big poplar tree. All he could see was an eye, the end of a tail, and one ear of a cougar peeking from behind the tree, watching him intently. His coworker was a ways away from him, so he kept facing the cougar and took 2-inch steps backward to avoid initiating a chase instinct in the cat. It took him half an hour to get back, whereas it would have taken 5 minutes walking normally. He and his coworker returned later to check the tracks, and the cougar had been following him all morning, mirroring his steps and stopping when he stopped. He was glad he had the gut feeling that day. Story 20. I was driving home late at night with a friend. We were listening to music and enjoying the drive. As I drove down a hill, I told my friend I felt really uncomfortable and that something bad was going to happen, even though it was a very quiet night. I drove a little slower and kept my eyes focused on the road. All of a sudden, I saw headlights coming toward me, but not in the correct lane. Next thing I knew, my car was completely turned perpendicular to the road, almost an inch from a telephone pole on my passenger side. I immediately started screaming for help because my leg was stuck. I was confused since the airbag had deployed, and I accidentally punched myself in the face. My window was gone, and glass was everywhere. A woman came running to help me get out of the back of the car because she smelled gas. I sat in her car with a blanket while I called my mom to come get me. She was upset because I didn't know the extent of the accident. I saw the other vehicle in the middle of the road. The woman's husband and son were both running into the woods because the other driver had fled. Somehow, I didn't break anything. I sprained my ankle, got a large bruise on my leg, had a bloody nose, and suffered a concussion. The sheriff told me he was shocked I was still alive. My car was totaled, and my engine was no longer in my vehicle. When my mom arrived, she was horrified and felt terrible that she hadn't been nicer. Sadly, the man was only charged with hit and run and not driving under the influence. He was in his 40s and had done this before. He should never have been allowed to drive again. The emergency medical technicians and paramedics were amazing, and I'm grateful to work for a company that collaborates with ambulances. Story 21. Woodstock 99 chose to get up early and pack the car on the last day before things went wrong. A stroke of genius. Story 22. We were playing at a popular low-water bridge at a stream crossing, where several families were enjoying time with their children in a clear running stream. I told my daughter, who is 9 years old, to put on her life jacket. A few minutes later, she was pulled into the vortex of a drainage culvert that ran under the road. She emerged on the other side bruised and battered, but alive. There was no visible sign, such as swirling water, indicating the hazard. Without the life jacket, she might have drowned, and it certainly provided some protection against the rough walls. She was fine after a visit to the emergency room. Story 23. In the early 1990s, there was a huge windstorm in California. A friend and I were driving south on a highway. Visibility was close to zero due to all the dust flying around. We decided to pull over to the shoulder of the highway. I still have an unsettled feeling and said I thought we should pull into the field next to the highway. After about 20 minutes, the dust began to clear enough for about 50 feet of visibility. Right near where we had been were several cars that had collided. My friend still brings it up and wonders how I knew. Story 24. I had a bad feeling that started at night and persisted throughout the day. I thought I was just feeling anxious due to some false perception. But no, my mother and baby brother were in a serious car accident. As soon as I heard the news, that feeling dissipated. But I had been on edge all day. Story 25. I was driving to pick up cannabis back in my college days. I took dark back roads and had made the drive many times. On this particular night, I was on one of the back roads that was about 5 miles long, with high cornfields on both sides. About halfway down the road, I had an overwhelming gut feeling to take my foot off the gas and slow down a bit, so I did without hesitation. About 4 seconds later, a car with no headlights flew out of the cornfield, crossed the road, and continued into the cornfield on the other side. It was jarring, and I will never understand it. I would have certainly been dead had I kept going at the speed I was. Story 26. December 1987. I had 2 weeks of leave, and I went to Milwaukee to spend Christmas with a friend who had been discharged from the military that year. During my visit, my friend came out to me as being gay. He was awkward and funny. I told him that I had figured it out on my own. As long as he was okay with me being straight, I was okay with him being gay. We had a great time, including a lot of bar hopping. In one particular bar, we were approached by a nice-looking blonde man. My friend and I did what had become a routine, both of us saying straight, while he pointed at me, and we laughed. The man took it well, laughed with us, sat down, and started talking to my friend. I got a weird vibe from him, even though he was nice and polite. I took my friend aside and suggested we leave. My friend was not exactly happy with me, but we left. We had a long and somewhat tense discussion when we got back to my friend's apartment. I had no response except that the blonde man just gave me bad vibes. I went back to my duty station after extracting a promise from my friend that if he saw the blonde man again, he would leave the bar. That man was Jeffrey Dahmer. Story 27. I was 15 and had a friend who was difficult. He showed up at my house one night and asked if I wanted to go for a ride. I declined because I had a bad feeling about it. Hours later, they were all arrested. The car turned out to be stolen. Story 28. This happened almost 7 years ago. I was engaged to my ex and felt something was off in our relationship for months. He had cheated in the past, and I guess he thought he got better at hiding it. There weren't any obvious signs, but my instincts prompted me to check my cell phone records because he had been using my phone recently. I didn't even know it was possible to check that with prepaid phone plans, but I decided to try. There was no proof on the phone itself, but the records revealed approximately 150 texts a day with his married manager at work. When I confronted him, he admitted what was happening. It had been going on for 6 months, and I would never have known if I hadn't checked my phone records. Story 29. I am not friends with this girl, but she was my coworker for a while. She started dating an ex-military man who seemed perfect, and her parents loved him. He stayed at their house, and the relationship moved very quickly. I only met him a few times at work, but his demeanor raised several red flags for me, and I felt a bit scared of him. You know those people who seem to be holding back their personality in public? I hinted at my concerns to her mother, who also worked there, but she was completely enamored with him. My concerns fell on deaf ears, but several other coworkers agreed that something was off about him. They ended up moving out of state, and she became isolated from her family. She married him, and then the abuse started. Thankfully, she got out safely. Story 30. Not as intriguing as some stories, but when I was 18, I delivered pizzas for a local shop. One year, I worked on New Year's Eve for a few hours before heading to a party at my girlfriend's house. This was in the late 1980s, and at that time, I never wore a seatbelt while driving. This was true for the first few deliveries of the night. Then, before one delivery, I stopped to get gas, and when I got in to leave, something prompted me to put on my seatbelt. As I was driving the order to the house, something ran in front of me on the road. I swerved to avoid it, hit a patch of ice, and crashed head-on into a telephone pole. The car was totaled, but I walked away with just a bruised knee. I have worn my seatbelt ever since. Story 31. When I was 12, my godmother and I talked about going on a trip to Egypt. For years, we discussed it and planned it for when I turned 16. When I turned 16, I remember having a horrible feeling. I called her and asked if we could go to Italy instead. I was studying Italian in school, and she was fully supportive of changing our plans. I remember arriving at the hotel room in Rome and turning on the TV. It was the 2011 Egyptian Revolution. I don't know enough about the revolution to comment on it, but I can say it was quite chaotic. It would not have been very safe for a 16-year-old and her 65-year-old godmother. I have no idea what compelled me to change my mind, but I have never had such a strong gut feeling before or since. Story 32. After our first child was born, I couldn't have more kids, so we started the adoption process. I wanted a little girl, but one day, a little boy with Down syndrome appeared on my computer screen, and I thought, oh, there's my son. I kept scrolling for a moment, then thought, wait, what? And went back to his little face. That was 14 years ago, and he is an absolutely amazing kid. Similarly, we had a foster baby that the workers thought would be adopted. 2 to 3 days after she arrived, I laid her in her crib and just knew she wasn't going to be my child. She was reunited with her mom about 5 months later, and we supported them for many years afterward. Story 33. I was an outgoing member of the condominium association's steering committee and was introduced to a non-resident who was put forward as the incoming leader of the steering committee. My gut instinct regarding him was so strong, it felt like a punch. The man was a complete stranger to me and very pleasant. I had no idea why I had such a strong reaction but trusted my instincts. A month later, we had our General Assembly, and one of the things we voted on was financial compensation to members of the steering committee, with the non-resident voted in as the new leader. There was a request for extra compensation for him, as his role was to help us improve our organization. I was the only one in a room of about 100 people to vote no by a show of hands. I did not change my vote. 9 months later, our association was in a crisis. Large sums of money had gone missing, but we couldn't prove how, so we couldn't report the issue to the police. However, at our extraordinary assembly, we all agreed to remove members from the steering committee we couldn't trust, including the non-resident leader, who had ultimate responsibility. It was then decided that he would also not receive his extra financial compensation. I remember one neighbor glanced over at me at that moment, wondering how I knew. Story 34. I was at a college party before a football game in the afternoon. I got a strange, uneasy feeling and told my girlfriend that I thought we should go home since I lived just 3 blocks away. As soon as I walked into the house, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was from my hometown. It was one of my best friend's fathers. My friend had died the night before, and they had just found him. Story 35. On a regular morning in North Florida, my partner and I were getting ready for work. I was running late and texted my manager. My partner received an alert on his phone indicating bad weather ahead. No big deal. We live in Florida, and heavy rainstorms are normal. However, I felt an uneasy sensation. I wanted to grab a foam mattress topper from the bed and hang out in the hallway. My partner thought differently and let the dog out. As I observed the stillness outside and the storm approaching, my partner brought the dog inside. Not even 10 seconds after closing the back door, 2 tornadoes merged and struck us directly. I remember a wall of rain, darkness, and our huge oak tree coming toward the house as we jumped into the hallway. We were safe, but our neighborhood was devastated, and many homes were lost. This area hadn't experienced a direct hit by a tornado in 300 years, so the entire town was shocked by how quickly and randomly the rainstorm escalated. This is one of my told you so moments with my partner. He believes me more now. Story 36. My brother's father had an off-roading vehicle, and he, my brother, my mother, and I were in the woods having a great time. We came across a steep hill, and they all wanted him to accelerate. They were cheering and encouraging him to go. I sensed something was wrong, so I got out of the vehicle, walked into the middle of the path to block their way, and ran to the top of the hill. I looked down at a drop of over 50 feet into rocks. There was no cell service, and no one else knew we were out there. We would have simply died at the bottom of that cliff. Story 37. I'm not sure this is the same, but I find it incredibly interesting. I have a temporary heart condition that requires me to keep my heart rate down, including avoiding caffeine. A couple of weeks ago, on Friday, I had my first symptoms. On Saturday, I clearly had a heart problem and received the diagnosis in the emergency room. However, on Thursday, before I knew anything was wrong, the thought of drinking a can of soda disgusted me, which is not a normal reaction to a beverage I typically enjoy. Did my body know something I couldn't? Story 38. I noticed rain clouds rolling in and decided I needed to take my dog outside to relieve itself immediately. It didn't seem like the rain was very close, and we could have waited until after it passed. For some reason, I hurried us to the backyard and then back inside. About 30 seconds later, straight-line winds came through. The electrical pole in the backyard fell exactly where we would have been standing if we had been any slower, and we couldn't go outside because electrical lines were hanging over the doorway. It always felt so strange to me that I had that urgent need to rush, but it might have saved both of our lives. Story 39. I used to deliver dairy and deli products in a 26-foot box truck. At one store, I had to back up the width of the building, turn 90 degrees, and back up the length of it. There was no camera in that truck. I had a new employee with me, and she was always baffled at how I could drive in reverse using just mirrors. This was our second to last stop out of about 15 stores, and I reached the corner of the building and stopped. I turned to her and said, "I don't like it. Can you please check to see if I'm going to hit something?" Confused, she got out and walked back to check for me. Expecting her to pop into my mirror view, I waited a full minute before I started wondering if she misunderstood me. I was about to get out when she hopped back into the truck and said there were 4 kids playing on the loading dock, but she got them inside with their mother. I sat there for a good 5 minutes processing that I had avoided a possible disaster based on a gut feeling alone. I forgot to mention this was a route I had done hundreds of times without pausing. I'll never know why I stopped, but I'm glad I did. Story 40. My dad knocked on my bedroom door one Sunday morning about 10 years ago. He told me he wasn't feeling well and my uncle was going to come over to check on him. I took one look at him and, without hesitation, called an ambulance. When the paramedics arrived, he was having a massive heart attack. That was a very traumatic ambulance ride, let me tell you. Story 41. My first child was normal but small, which disturbed me. I asked at each pediatric visit if she was really all right and was told she was fine. I even took a book out of the local public health library about how to evaluate a very young infant or child. She was so young, only a little over a month, that the only test I could do was related to head lag, and I noticed she wasn't really holding her head up as much as she should have. Then, when she was 6 weeks old, I was holding her when she suddenly had a moment that I later learned was an epileptic seizure in an infant. It turned out she had a rare condition from birth and ended up extremely intellectually delayed and never learned to talk. My instinct that something was really wrong was correct, even though no one else noticed it. Story 42. My first weekend at my old army unit, a woman started hitting on me aggressively. She was beautiful and I was young and frustrated, but my instincts urged me to run in the opposite direction. I turned her down. She was angry and my friends called me gay. A week later, she and 7 men tested positive for chlamydia. Story 43. I was supposed to go to school one day in 9th grade. I woke up with a strong urge to stay home. It was a strange feeling since school was much better than being at home. My mom was upset that I refused to go but went to work, stating she wasn't going to argue with me. A couple of hours later, the house phone rang while I was home alone. I answered, and it was my grandmother, who lives about 5 hours away. She was very upset and thankful I picked up. She had seen my school bus on the national news that morning. Due to fog, there had been an accident, and the bus flipped off the side of the highway, resulting in the deaths of 2 students and the bus driver. At that point, they didn't know how many were injured or deceased, so she fully expected the phone to keep ringing. Story 44. I used to own a motorcycle when I was younger. A series of choices led to me selling it and moving to another state. Fast forward a few years, and I am married with kids, but my wife doesn't want me to get a new bike. She has never ridden one and finds them scary. I have a friend who rides, and I convinced her to go on a ride with him to try something new. They went around the block a few times and returned. We were hanging out for a bit longer and having a few drinks when my friend decided he wanted to go downtown to a bar. My wife asked to ride along and I said sure. They got ready to go, and I had a strong gut feeling it was a bad idea. Then I talked her out of going. She was disappointed, but that happens. My friend laid down his bike while driving to the bar. He broke his arm and got seriously injured. Now, she is completely against me getting a bike. I can live without the bike, but not without her. Story 45. 2 years ago, when I moved to the state, I took my family to a major park in the city. I felt uneasy and moved around the park several times, trying to escape this feeling. We left because I couldn't shake my discomfort. Shortly afterward, someone was shot at the park. Story 46. I was walking home in the dark after a night out a while ago when I suddenly felt an overwhelming urge not to take my usual shortcut through an alley. It's pretty creepy, but I normally don't care much. There was no real reason for it, just an instinctual dread. I took the long way, which added only about 5 minutes to my walk. The next day, I discovered from neighbors that someone had been attacked and robbed in that exact alley during the same time I would have been there. I have never ignored that kind of feeling since. Gut instincts are real. It still troubles me, to be honest. Story 47. At a dub reggae night in Leeds, something felt off about the whole atmosphere. I thought I might be paranoid from the cannabis, so I ignored it. Half an hour later, someone barged in past the bouncers and sprayed bullets around, trying to shoot someone. Story 48. One time in college, I was walking home from a party and felt like I was being followed. Every time I looked back, no one was there. Eventually, as I got closer to my apartment, I saw a man lurking about half a block behind me. I did a loop and he was still behind me. I ended up walking to the campus security office near my place, and as soon as I got under the bright lights out front, he turned down another block. Story 49. My sister and a friend were walking back from the bus to their flat. The friend was desperate to use the bathroom, and they found a public toilet. My sister had a funny feeling about it, but thought it was just because public restrooms are usually unpleasant. She persuaded her friend to hold on a bit longer and go use the McDonald's restroom instead, which they did. Turns out that someone had poured acid over the seats, and I'm pretty sure it made the news. Story 50. I have been active in the acro yoga community for years. The vast majority of the time, the interactions are healthy, fun, and uplifting. However, similar to other trust-based arts such as yoga and swing dance, every once in a while, a bad actor will come along whose intent is to manipulate women and sometimes assault them. Recently, a new person moved to town who immediately raised my concerns as a potential danger. He began acting like a bigger deal locally than he was, being very vocal in all the group chats and making no attempt to learn the tone of the local group before jumping in. It was reminiscent of that person in the freshman dorms who quickly declares themselves the leader, saying, "Who's up for some bowling tonight?" while everyone else looks at each other, wondering, who is this person? What I have realized after several instances of dealing with community predators is that they tend to have a pattern of being removed from previous groups. They never learn their lesson. Instead, they view themselves as the victim and immediately pop up in another similar group, or maybe the same type of group in a different town. The vibe I sensed from this new individual indicated that he had been booted from one community and wanted to quickly regain equal status in another so he could resume his manipulative behaviors. In groups like this, reputation is everything, and it can only be earned with time and consistent respectful behavior. In short, beware anyone attempting to cut the line. Sure enough, within a couple of months, someone at one of our meetups noticed this person on the sidelines and informed us that he was in the process of being removed from a local dance group due to concerning behavior toward women. I suspect there is a history of other communities that have asked him to leave as well. Story 51. In my early 20s, I dated a guy in a band. The girlfriends went to every show and always had a great time. But one night I had a strange feeling and suggested we stay back and do something at my place instead. A couple of days later, we found out someone at the show had drugged several women's drinks with Xanax. Many women were affected, and one of them died. I don't know if it was a gut instinct or if I just didn't feel like going, but either way, I'm still very thankful none of us were there. Story 52. I always have a strong instinct when I meet a person for the first time. It instantly makes me like or dislike them. There is never a neutral feeling. When I mentioned my instant dislike for a friend's spouse to my husband, he was shocked and taken aback. However, months later, he came to the same conclusion. I realized that my instinct for judging a person is accurate. Story 53. I knew that my child had a specific genetic condition, despite not having physical markers commonly associated with it. She underwent genetic testing about a decade later for a different reason, and the genetic marker for the condition was found. It is not a genetic trait passed down from parents, and no relatives on either side are known to have this condition. Story 54. When I was a child, I was a night owl and so was my mother. One night, I saw my mom grabbing her keys and putting on clothes to go out, and I asked what she was doing. She said she needed to go to the grocery store and was taking my two other siblings with her. I sensed something bad was going to happen, so I begged her not to go. She went anyway. The store was held at gunpoint while the robber attacked everyone. My mom and siblings were in the back of the store and were not seen. The robbery was over in minutes, and thankfully, nobody was hurt. We had a special speaker at church who managed to get information and materials into other countries to help people. He was an older gentleman. He shared how he needed a heart procedure but had been putting it off because he did not want to deal with the recovery. His pastor and his wife had been encouraging him to undergo the procedure because they were concerned he might die if he did not. I realized then that the procedure intended to save his life could end it. A couple of months later, when he finally had the procedure, we received notice that he died during surgery. Story 55. I was a junior in high school during gym class just before lunch. Our assistant principal walked in and called the teacher over. I said to my best friend, "He's here for me." She asked me how I knew if I was in trouble. I told her I just had a sense. I had been off all morning. I went with him to the office, where my mom's best friend was waiting to pick me up because my dad was in the hospital. He had actually died from a heart attack that morning, and she was taking me to the hospital to say goodbye and be with my mom. Story 56. Not mine, but my mother's story. She and her older brother grew up in the United Kingdom, but their family would visit Germany often because their mother's family lived in Hamburg. This was the late 1930s. At the end of August 1939, the two of them were there, having a lovely time and being spoiled. Their grandfather was not having a lovely time. He had a bad feeling about things and called their mother in the United Kingdom. Adolf Hitler had been in power for a couple of years, but tensions were escalating militarily. He was sure that Der Krieg kommt. Normally, the two siblings would travel back and forth by ferry, but this time, their grandfather was really worried and managed to secure 2 plane tickets for a flight from Hamburg to Croydon, stopping in Copenhagen for fuel. I can't imagine what that cost in money and favors. Anyway, they flew back to the United Kingdom on a Sunday. The following Friday, Hitler invaded Poland. Story 57. Back in the mid to late 1990s, I was under house arrest for some pending drug charges. I didn't have an ankle monitor, so I naturally didn't stay home. At one point, some friends and I were on the way to a dealer's house to pick up some marijuana. During the ride there, I suddenly had a strong feeling that I shouldn't go. I asked my friends to drop me off at the next corner, which they did. It turned out that the dealer's house was being monitored by the police. They were pulling over and arresting everyone who left. Story 58. I felt very ill to my stomach, but my mom asked me to take my brother and his friends to a party. I tried to tell her I didn't feel well and would rather not go, but she insisted. Halfway there, we were in a head-on collision that totaled the car, and we sustained a few minor injuries. I had nightmares for years, and I still panic a little if a car gets too close to me. That was 32 years ago. Story 59. Many years ago, I was visiting family in another state. I met up with my uncle for a church event and had a gut feeling that he was going to die. Since it was the last day I would be in the state, I asked if he wanted to spend time together before I left. We did, and I returned home. A couple of weeks later, I received a call that he was in the hospital due to heart failure, and he died soon after. It was both the best and worst time to have that gut feeling because, otherwise, I wouldn't have had my last moments with him be so positive. A part of me also felt he knew he was going to die soon, as he readily accepted my invitation to hang out. Sadly, I can't ask him now. Story 60. Years ago, while working in an office job at a young person's mental health organization, I spoke with a young woman on the phone who was inquiring about when she would be allocated a counselor. We received numerous requests like this every day, But this time something felt different. I informed the duty team, who reached out to her on the off chance, and it turned out she was going through a terrible time at home recently. The school had been contacted regarding safeguarding, and her mental health and stability had really deteriorated. I hoped that speaking to a qualified counselor would be of some help to her. Story 61. I was just beginning my second year of university. It was not long into the fall semester when I had one class in the afternoon. I was all ready to leave for class, putting on my shoes, when I suddenly felt a wave of anxiety and a sense that I shouldn't go in. I debated what to do, and ultimately decided to use the afternoon at home to get a head start on a project. About half an hour later, I started hearing numerous sirens, more than I had ever heard in my life. I turned on the radio and learned that there was an active shooter at the university. Story 62. It was a Monday, and we were supposed to take a chemistry test. I had a bad feeling unrelated to the test, so I told my parents I was feeling sick and stayed home. I started browsing the news randomly and saw something happening in my village, although I didn't know what it was. It turned out to be an article about a significant police stakeout. We suspected it was related to drugs since the police had stopped my parents while trying to go home. Later that day, we found out that 2 girls had been attacked with a knife on their way to school, just short of my stop and theirs. Usually, I take an earlier bus, but that day the bus had run late, so I would likely have been there when they were attacked. One girl, the daughter of our landlord, died. The other girl was a sibling of an old classmate, so I knew them both. It's honestly insane that my instincts spared me from highly traumatizing moments. I didn't go to school for about a week afterward because they had set up signs, candles, and everything else at the crime scene just across from the bus stop. I still had to cry every time I got off the bus and saw people standing there. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.